Some moments have the power to change everything. James thought his life was on track, married to the woman he loved, preparing for a future he had meticulously planned. But when he stepped into Antonio's custom tailoring for a wedding tuxedo fitting, something shifted. A seemingly routine moment sparked a connection that would make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. What happens when the person you thought you were isn't who you truly are? This is where James's journey of self-discovery begins. And trust me, it's a path you won't want to miss. James had always thought he knew exactly who he was, a man with a clear path, a loving fiancée, and a life meticulously planned out. Sarah was the one, his perfect match. They had been together for years, and everything was set for their wedding. No one could have predicted that it would all change in an instant. It all started with a trip to Antonio's custom tailoring, a place known for its precision, attention to detail, and years of tradition. It was meant to be nothing more than a routine fitting for his tuxedo. A moment that should have been about nothing more than getting measurements, adjusting sleeves, and making sure the suit was perfect for his big day. But as James stepped into the shop, he couldn't have known that something as simple as the touch of a tailor's hand would unravel everything he thought he understood about himself. Antonio was the tailor who had been entrusted with the suit, a man with an unmistakable calm, a practiced hand, and a quiet strength in his presence. From the moment Antonio began measuring James, something stirred inside of him. The first touch wasn't anything extraordinary, just a simple measurement around the chest. But then, Antonio's hands lingered longer than they should have. The air shifted. James, trying to ignore the unease bubbling inside of him, focused on the upcoming wedding, the life he was about to start with Sarah. But there was something in Antonio's touch, something in the way his fingers moved along James's body, that made him pause. His breath caught for a moment, not from discomfort, but from a feeling he couldn't quite name. His heart rate quickened, and not because of the wedding. He felt an undeniable spark of something unfamiliar, something deeper than just a tailored suit. He could feel the heat from Antonio's hands, and with that, everything changed. It was a moment that should have been routine, but it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. What was it about Antonio's touch that sent waves of electricity through him? What was it about the way Antonio's eyes met his? An unspoken understanding that neither of them could ignore. For James, this wasn't about a wedding tuxedo anymore. It was about something far more complicated. As the fitting continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. Every brush of Antonio's hands across James's body, every flicker of eye contact deepened the tension between them. It was an unexpected spark, one that James didn't know how to handle. It was something he never thought he'd feel, not like this. Certainly not when he was on the brink of marrying Sarah, a woman he truly loved. But love, as we know, doesn't always unfold according to the script we write for ourselves. Sometimes, it catches us by surprise, tearing through the walls we've carefully built around our lives, forcing us to confront what we've been too afraid to see. And that's exactly what was happening to James. As Antonio worked, James tried to push aside the growing sense of attraction, the confusion that gnawed at him. But it was no use. His thoughts drifted, not to Sarah, but to Antonio. He couldn't help but notice the way Antonio moved with such ease, the precision with which he worked, and the deep confidence he exuded. There was a magnetic pull between them, something neither of them could ignore. And what made it all the more complicated was that James didn't even know what to do with these feelings. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not now, not when he was committed to someone else. James couldn't help but feel like this touch, this connection, was something he had been waiting for without even knowing it. For the first time, he questioned his engagement, he questioned his future, Was he really marrying Sarah because he loved her? Or because it was what he was supposed to do? The longer he stood there, in the mirror's reflection, the more confused he became. He felt pulled in two directions, toward the life he had planned, and the life that was unfolding before him, with Antonio. The question that gnawed at him was whether this was just a momentary lapse, or if this was something more. A momentary attraction. Or the beginning of something that would change the course of his life. Antonio seemed to sense the shift in James, though he didn't say anything. His movements were calm, collected, but there was a noticeable awareness in his gaze. The electricity between them wasn't something Antonio could ignore either. It was there, palpable, in the way his hands brushed too close, in the way their eyes met and lingered just a bit too long. At that moment, James's world began to feel small. The fabric, the mirrors, the tuxedo, it all faded away, leaving just the two of them in the room. No longer was this about the suit or the wedding. It was about James's heart, about what he wanted and what he feared. He was standing at a crossroads, staring into an unfamiliar future, unsure of how to proceed. The man who was supposed to be fitting him for his wedding suit was now making him question everything about his life. James had always thought that love was simple. He had thought that his feelings for Sarah were all that mattered. But now, standing in that small, elegant fitting room, he realized that love and attraction were far more complicated than he could have imagined. This moment, this spark with Antonio, had shattered the idea of a neatly planned life. It made him question whether he had been living in a world built on expectations of his family, his friends, and even of himself. As the fitting drew to a close, James realized that he wasn't just getting measured for a tuxedo. He was being measured for a life he wasn't sure he was ready for. The suit, the wedding, the future, all of it seemed uncertain now. Antonio's lingering touch had unlocked something in James, something that made him see the cracks in his perfect life. And for the first time, he felt the stirring of something new, a desire to explore this uncharted territory, to live authentically, even if it meant turning his entire life upside down. The fitting room may have been small, but it had become the space where James was beginning to confront himself, to peel away the layers of expectation and start seeing what his heart really wanted. It was a quiet revolution, a personal awakening that, in the coming days, would force James to make decisions that would change everything. And as James stood there, breathless and uncertain, one thing was clear. The story of his life had just begun, and it was going to be far different from what he had expected. What would he do with this newfound spark? How would it shape the choices he made moving forward? One thing was for certain, it wouldn't be easy. But in the end, it would be real. What comes next for James? Will he continue down the path he's been on? Or will he take the leap into the unknown, following the pull of his heart? Stay tuned. James sat in his car outside Antonio's custom tailoring, staring at the building, unsure of what to do next. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, a flood of emotions he couldn't understand or control. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, about his future, it was all slipping through his fingers. He had always believed that life was simple, that if you followed the rules, if you did things in the right order, everything would fall into place. Get engaged, get married, build a life. But what happens when you realize the life you've built isn't the one you truly want? The tuxedo fitting was supposed to be a simple errand, a task checked off the list before the wedding. But that one moment, that brief lingering touch between him and Antonio, had turned everything upside down. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time James could see his life for what it truly was. A series of compromises, decisions made because it was expected of him, not because they felt right. It's hard to admit that you've been living a lie, even to yourself. James had never questioned his relationship with Sarah before. They had been together for years, and everything seemed perfect. They had their routines, their plans, their shared vision for the future. They had talked about their wedding for months, made decisions about the flowers, the venue, the guest list. It was all set. Or so he thought. But now, as James thought about Sarah, all he could feel was a sense of disconnection. A hollow space that he hadn't noticed before. When he looked at her, he didn't feel that rush of excitement, that raw connection. Instead, it was a gentle, comforting warmth. There was nothing wrong with that. It was a love based on years of companionship, of familiarity, of security. But was that enough? Was that really the kind of love he wanted to spend the rest of his life with? Then there was Antonio. Antonio, the tailor who had come into his life at the most unexpected moment. In the span of a few minutes, Antonio had made him feel things he didn't know he was capable of feeling. There was an intensity in Antonio's touch, a connection that James couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't just physical. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that stirred him in a way he hadn't experienced before. How was he supposed to make sense of that? James was torn. His mind was screaming at him to stop. This was crazy. He was engaged to Sarah. He had a life planned out. This kind of thing just wasn't supposed to happen. But then his heart was pulling him in another direction. The pull toward Antonio was undeniable, magnetic, and it terrified him. The way Antonio had looked at him, the way his touch lingered, the way he had made James feel seen, really seen for the first time, it was all too much. James thought about the conversation he'd had with Sarah just the night before. They'd talked about the wedding, about their future, about their dreams. Sarah was excited. She was ready. She was everything he thought he wanted. But now, as he replayed the conversation in his mind, he realized that he had been telling her what she wanted to hear. He hadn't been fully honest with himself, let alone her. He had been so focused on doing what was expected, on fulfilling the role that everyone had placed on him, that he had forgotten to listen to his own heart. What did he truly want? It was easier to follow the path of least resistance, the one that had been laid out for him. It was easier to go along with what everyone else expected. But what if that wasn't the life he was meant to live? James couldn't help but wonder, was he marrying Sarah because he loved her, or because it was the safe choice, the familiar choice, the choice that everyone around him would approve of? He had always believed that love was a simple thing. But now he realized that love wasn't always about comfort or familiarity. Sometimes love was about taking risks, about stepping into the unknown, about being true to who you really were. But how could he make such a drastic change? How could he tell Sarah that he wasn't sure about the life they had planned together? How could he possibly walk away from everything they had built? These questions consumed him. And then there was Antonio. There was no denying the way he made James feel. The way his touch had sent waves of electricity through his body. The way he had made James question his entire future with Sarah. Was this the kind of love James had been searching for? Or was it just a fleeting moment, an infatuation that would fade once the dust settled? What was the right thing to do? James had always been a man of certainty. He had always known what he wanted, at least he thought he had. But now, everything was up in the air. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out into the unknown. The life he thought he wanted was right there behind him, but ahead of him, there was nothing but uncertainty. The more James thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't want to live a life based on someone else's expectations. He didn't want to marry Sarah just because it was the next logical step. He didn't want to settle for a life that was comfortable, safe, and predictable. He wanted more. He wanted to feel alive. He wanted to experience love in a way he never had before. But was he brave enough to walk away from everything he had known? James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to be honest with himself. He needed to confront the truth about who he was and what he truly wanted. But that truth was terrifying. It meant admitting that the life he had built with Sarah wasn't the life he was meant to live. It meant confronting his own desires, his own fears, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But in that moment, as he sat in his car outside Antonio's shop, James realized that he couldn't keep living a life that wasn't his own. He had to choose authenticity. He had to choose himself. But what did that look like? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about choosing between Sarah and Antonio. It wasn't about picking one person over another. It was about choosing the kind of life he wanted to live. It was about choosing honesty, vulnerability, and courage over comfort, over what was easy. This was the turning point. James knew that whatever decision he made would change his life forever. And even though he was terrified, he knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't unfeel what he had felt in that fitting room. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward Antonio. He couldn't deny that he wanted something more than the life he had planned. The question was he ready to take that step? As he got out of the car and walked toward the shop, James felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep questioning everything. He had to make a choice, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. And with each step he took toward Antonio's door, he knew he was moving closer to the truth about who he was, about what he wanted, and about the love he was ready to embrace. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. James sat in his car, parked outside Antonio's custom tailoring, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. His hand gripped the steering wheel as he took a slow, steadying breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. The question that had been swirling in his mind for days now stood at the forefront. What do I really want? And more importantly, who am I without all the expectations placed on me? He could feel the tension building inside of him. There was no escaping it now. The decision had been made for him. The choice had always been his to make, but the reality of it felt unbearable. He could stay in his safe, predictable life with Sarah, the woman who had been there for him through thick and thin, the woman he had promised to marry. Or he could step into the unknown, into the realm of vulnerability and desire, and embrace something with Antonio that felt undeniable. As James looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he didn't recognize the man who stared back at him. The face in the mirror was the same one he had seen for years, handsome, confident, with an easy smile that had served him well in the world he had built. But that was the problem, wasn't it? That smile had become a mask. Behind it was a man who had spent too long living for others, living according to the rules, living in a world of shoulds. He had never questioned anything before. He never needed to. The path had been laid out for him. It was clear. Get engaged to Sarah. Settle down, live the dream. But now that dream was beginning to unravel. The truth was, he didn't know if he could keep pretending any longer. The fitting room at Antonio's shop had started it all. It had seemed like a routine appointment. Just another task to cross off his wedding checklist. But from the moment Antonio's hands had touched him, everything had changed. It wasn't just a physical touch. It was the way Antonio had looked at him, the way he had made James feel seen in a way no one else ever had. It was a simple moment, but for James, it had opened a door he didn't even know existed. A door to questions he wasn't ready to face. Why had it felt so right? He thought about the way his body had reacted, the rush of electricity that surged through him. He thought about the way Antonio had been so patient, so gentle, understanding the gravity of what was happening without rushing him. Antonio had seen it in him, the hesitation, the conflict, and he had allowed James the space to process, to question, to wonder. But now, sitting in his car, the question had become unavoidable. What do I do with these feelings? This wasn't just about the attraction he felt for Antonio. This was about everything. It was about the life he had built, about the promises he had made, about the future he had planned. But most of all, it was about authenticity. Could he continue living a life that felt comfortable but suffocating? Or was he ready to break free and face the truth, no matter how scary or uncertain it might be? James's mind flashed to the conversation he had with Sarah the night before. They had talked about the wedding, about the future. She was excited. She was ready. She was everything he had thought he wanted. But when he looked at her, he didn't feel the same spark he once had. Instead, he felt a quiet emptiness, a hollow space where something more had once lived. He had convinced himself that this was normal. He had told himself it was just pre-wedding jitters. But now, sitting alone in his car, he realized that maybe it wasn't. Maybe this wasn't the life he was meant to live. Was it fair to Sarah? To marry her because it was the right thing to do? Because their families expected it? Because it was the comfortable choice? Or was he being unfair to himself by ignoring the truth? By living a life that wasn't true to who he was? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The questions he had been avoiding now screamed at him. Why did I say yes to this life? And why am I so afraid of embracing what feels true? He thought about Antonio again, the way he had stood close, the way his hands had moved with such careful precision, but also with an intensity that James had never felt before. It was a touch that wasn't just about measuring fabric, wasn't about fitting a suit. It was a touch that made him feel something raw, something powerful, something he didn't know he had been longing for. And the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. James's heart was racing as he opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. He wasn't sure what he was going to say when he walked into Antonio's shop. He wasn't sure of anything, to be honest. But what he did know was that he could no longer live in denial. He couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't keep moving through life as if everything was fine when deep down, he knew it wasn't. As he walked through the door, the familiar chime of the bell above the entrance sounded in his ears, marking the beginning of something new. Antonio was standing behind the counter, a slight smile on his face, but there was an intensity in his eyes that told James he knew exactly why he had returned. Antonio didn't say anything right away. He just looked at James, as if giving him the space to figure out his own thoughts, his own feelings. It was a silent understanding that passed between them. Antonio knew the decision James was facing. And though the moment was heavy with unspoken words, there was no pressure. Antonio wasn't pushing James for answers. He was simply there, ready when James was ready to make his move. The air between them was thick with the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. It was more than just a suit fitting. It was about truth, about breaking free from a life that no longer fit, about embracing something that felt right, even though it was uncertain. It was about stepping into the unknown and finding out who you really are, not who you've been told to be. James stood there for a moment, uncertain of his next move, but knowing deep down that this was the moment that would change everything. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of calm in the chaos, a certainty in the uncertainty. Antonio walked toward him, and for the first time since walking in, James didn't feel the usual weight of his worries pressing down on him. He felt lighter. There was something about Antonio's presence that made him feel seen, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. "What do you want, James?" Antonio's voice was soft but steady. It wasn't demanding. It was simply a question, one that James had to answer for himself. What did he want? What did he really want? James took a deep breath, the air steadying his nerves, his voice steadying as well. "I want to be honest. With myself, with you, with Sarah. I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not." Antonio nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's not easy, is it?" "No," James said, shaking his head. "It's not easy. But I've been living a lie, trying to fit into a life that isn't mine. I've been ignoring the truth because it's easier, but I can't do that anymore. I can't keep pretending." Antonio reached out and placed a hand gently on James's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight of understanding, of compassion, of acceptance. "You don't have to pretend with me, James. Whatever you decide, I'll be here." The words hung in the air, a lifeline for James, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this moment. For the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of clarity. He knew he couldn't keep living for everyone else's expectations. It was time to choose himself, time to embrace the unknown, time to live authentically. The decision wasn't easy, and James knew there would be consequences. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. Because sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that lead you to the truest version of yourself. And whatever happened next, he would be okay. In life, there are moments when everything aligns, when the weight of uncertainty, of doubt, of fear suddenly lifts, and you're left standing at the edge of something new, something undeniably true. That moment had come for James. He stood in Antonio's shop, the fabric of his world shifting in ways he never imagined. Yet somehow, everything felt more right than it ever had before. He had spent years living in the shadows of expectations. Everyone had their version of his life mapped out, his family, his friends, his fiancée. The path was clear, seemingly without question. He was going to marry Sarah. He was going to have the perfect life that everyone around him had envisioned. But in the quiet corners of his heart, in the stillness of his thoughts, James had begun to wonder if it was all just a facade. But now, there was no more denying it. The truth had emerged, not in a grand revelation, but in small, intimate moments that had begun to pile up, like little whispers of reality breaking through a wall of pretense. Antonio had opened his eyes, not with grand gestures, but with understanding, with patience, and with an acceptance of James's vulnerability that no one else had ever offered. James had always believed that love should be clear-cut, that it should follow a well-trodden path. But now, standing in front of Antonio, he realized that love wasn't something you could plan or schedule. It wasn't something that would fit neatly into a box, just because society told you it should. Love was raw, unpredictable, and most importantly, love was true when it felt right, when it made your heart race in a way you didn't understand, in a way that shattered everything you thought you knew about yourself. He had spent too long ignoring that feeling, trying to push it aside for the sake of the life he thought he should have. But now, that same feeling was pulling him forward, like gravity, urging him to take the leap and embrace who he truly was, without fear, without apologies. And so, he had made his choice. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was also the most freeing. James wasn't just choosing Antonio. He wasn't just choosing the life that felt true to him at this moment. He was choosing himself, choosing to break free from the suffocating weight of expectations, and to finally live authentically, to live in a way that honored who he really was. "I'm ready," he whispered to himself, not just in the mirror, not just to Antonio, but to his own heart. He had been living for so long according to someone else's script, a script handed down by society, by his family, by his past self. And now, for the first time, he was ready to write his own. Antonio stood there, waiting, giving him the space he needed, but also offering the quiet encouragement that said, "It's okay to be who you are. It's okay to love who you love. You are enough just as you are. There was no judgment in Antonio's gaze. There was only understanding. Antonio had walked this path before, had questioned his own desires, his own authenticity. And now James was taking that same step, just as bravely. In that moment, as their eyes locked, James felt a deep connection that went beyond anything he could have predicted. The uncertainty that had once filled him was replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He wasn't running away from his past, he was stepping into his future, and his future was not defined by what others expected of him, but by what felt right deep in his soul. The decision was not without its consequences. There were people in his life who would never understand. There were relationships that would be tested, friendships that might crumble. But James had come to understand something important in the past few days. You can't live for others forever. You can't base your happiness on the idea of what others think you should be, on the life they think you should live. The only life you can live is the one that's true to yourself. It's not always easy, it's not always straightforward, but it's the only one that can truly bring peace. James walked toward Antonio, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his step. The distance between them was no longer about physical space. It was the gap between the man he had been and the man he was about to become. And with each step, he felt the weight lifting off him, piece by piece. "I want this," James said, his voice steady, filled with an unshakable certainty. "I want you. I want to stop hiding from myself." Antonio's smile was soft, warm, and for the first time, James could see the truth in his eyes. This wasn't about taking advantage of a fleeting moment or acting on impulse. This was about something deeper, a connection that had always been there, waiting for them both to acknowledge it. "You don't have to pretend anymore," Antonio said, stepping closer, his voice a quiet promise. "You don't have to hide from what's true. What we have, what we could have, is real, and it's worth everything." James felt the warmth of Antonio's touch, felt it in the way Antonio cupped his face, as though he had been waiting for this moment as much as James had. There was no rush now, no urgency, only the understanding that they were both standing on the precipice of something beautiful, something that wasn't defined by labels or expectations. It was simply about them, two people, two souls, coming together in a moment that felt like everything. This wasn't just about love between them. It was about the courage to love yourself, to live the life that was waiting for you, even when it felt like you were stepping into the unknown. It was about the freedom to be who you are, unapologetically. And that freedom, that authenticity, was more beautiful than anything James had ever known. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments of fear. There would be people who wouldn't understand, but James was ready to face it all. Because in that moment, with Antonio by his side, he knew he was no longer afraid of the truth. He was embracing it, embracing the love, the life, the person he was meant to be. He wasn't just ready for what came next. He was excited. He was alive in a way he had never been before. The journey ahead was his to shape. It was no longer about playing it safe. It was about living. And that, in itself, was the most powerful choice he had ever made. And as Antonio kissed him gently, a kiss that spoke more than words could ever capture, James felt the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. He was where he was supposed to be. He was with the person he was meant to be with. And for the first time, he felt at peace. Because sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the most rewarding outcomes. And love, real love, is worth every step you take to find it. There are moments in life that feel like destiny, when everything you've gone through, every decision you've made, leads you to a single point in time. It's a moment when the world pauses, when you realize that everything has changed, and you are finally stepping into something you were meant for all along. For James, that moment had arrived. It wasn't just the culmination of his journey of self-discovery or the painful decision to call off his wedding to Sarah. It was more than that. It was a declaration, not just of love, but of freedom to be himself, to step into his truth and embrace a future that was truly his own. The moment was bigger than a proposal. It was the realization that love doesn't always follow a conventional path, and that's okay. As he stood there, in Antonio's shop once again, everything was different. The walls of mirrors that had once reflected his uncertainty now seemed to amplify a quiet certainty, a calm that filled him from the inside out. The journey had been difficult, full of painful truths and hard decisions. But now, standing here, everything made sense. This was his path, and Antonio was the person who had helped him find it. And so, with each step he took toward Antonio, James felt the weight of everything he had learned. The fear that had once held him back was no longer there. What had once been an intimidating future now felt like a promise, a life that was waiting for him to live fully and authentically. Antonio, ever patient, ever understanding, had given him the space to figure out who he was. But now, in this moment, James knew what he wanted, and more than anything, he wanted to share that with Antonio. The question that had lingered in his mind for months, the question that had been growing stronger with every moment spent with Antonio, was finally being answered. Not just in words, but in action, in a bold declaration of love, of commitment. James walked up to Antonio, his heart racing but steady. The anticipation, the thrill, the fear, it was all there, but so was the certainty. This wasn't a moment to back away from. It was a moment to embrace. Antonio met his eyes, that familiar warmth in his gaze, the same understanding that had guided James through the most confusing and challenging parts of his journey. No words were needed. It was clear that they both knew what was about to happen. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet space where two people, whose paths had crossed in unexpected ways, were about to make a decision that would shape their future together. James took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just about love. It was about trust. It was about honoring the journey they had been on together, and understanding that while the world might not always understand their choices, what mattered most was that they understood each other. And that, to James, was enough. "I want you to know something," James said, his voice calm but strong, filled with the weight of everything he had discovered. "You didn't just change my life. You made me realize what it means to live fully, without hiding parts of myself anymore." Antonio's smile was soft, his eyes filled with warmth. But there was something deeper there too, a recognition of the transformation that had taken place in both of them. James continued, his heart beating louder now. "I've spent so much of my life trying to fit into the mold others set for me, trying to live up to their expectations. But the truth is, I was never really living. Not until I met you. There was a pause. The weight of his words hung between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was a beautiful silence, one that held the space for everything they were about to say and everything they had already shared. Antonio stepped closer, the connection between them palpable in the air. "James," he whispered, his voice filled with sincerity. "You don't have to say anything more." But James wasn't done. He wasn't just sharing his feelings. He was sharing his future. "I know we've both been through a lot, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The moment stretched between them. Time seemed to stand still. Then, in a movement that felt both inevitable and magical, James took a step back, and, with a quiet confidence, he dropped to one knee. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Antonio's gaze never wavered, and neither did James's. There was no grand gesture, no overwhelming spectacle. Just the raw simplicity of a man who had found himself, and was now asking the man he loved to join him in that journey. "I want you to be my future," James said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with so much strength. "Will you marry me, Antonio?" And in that moment, everything fell into place. The love, the challenges, the fears, the decisions. It all led to this. Antonio's smile widened, his eyes shining with tears that matched the emotion flooding through James. "Yes," Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." James stood up, his hands trembling as he reached for Antonio, pulling him into an embrace that spoke louder than words ever could. This was it. The moment when everything changed. The moment when their future together was no longer a possibility, but a reality. The kiss they shared in that moment was more than just a kiss. It was the culmination of everything they had experienced, of everything they had discovered about each other and about themselves. It was the promise of a future, not bound by convention, but defined by the love they had found in each other. As they pulled away, James could feel the weight of the world fall away from his shoulders. It wasn't about the wedding, the proposal, or even the ring. It was about the life they were about to create, the love they were about to nurture, and the truth they had both finally embraced. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for James and Antonio, but for anyone who had ever doubted that love could transcend boundaries, expectations, and conventions. It was a testament to the power of choosing authenticity over fear, love over comfort, and truth over convenience. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can do in life is to choose the love that makes you feel alive. The love that sets you free. And for James, that love had a name. Antonio. As we close this chapter of James and Antonio's story, it's impossible not to reflect on what true love really means. We live in a world filled with expectations. Expectations about who we should love, when we should love, and how love should look. Society gives us blueprints for our lives, and sometimes we feel like we have no choice but to follow them. But what happens when we choose to step off the well-worn path? What happens when we decide that our love story doesn't have to look like anyone else's? James and Antonio's journey shows us that love is not about fitting into a mold, a formula, or a plan. It's about authenticity. It's about choosing the love that sets you free, the love that ignites a spark inside you, and the love that doesn't ask you to be anything other than who you are. True love isn't bound by timelines or labels or the expectations of others. It's about what feels true to you. For James, that moment of clarity came when he stopped living for other people's expectations. He wasn't just asking Antonio to be part of his life. He was asking himself to live the life that he had buried inside for so long. A life where he could love freely, without fear, without apology. And that's a choice we all have to make at some point. A choice to live authentically, even when the world around us might not understand. It's easy to follow the path that everyone else tells us to walk. It's easy to choose comfort, predictability, and the safety of the known. But real growth, real transformation, happens when we embrace the unknown. It happens when we take the risk to be vulnerable, to show up as our true selves, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. James could have continued down the path he had already set for himself, marrying Sarah, settling into a life that was comfortable. but ultimately untrue to who he was. But he chose a different path. He chose Antonio. He chose love that felt real, and in doing so, he chose himself. That's the power of true love. It doesn't ask you to settle. It doesn't ask you to conform. It pushes you to be the best, truest version of yourself. It challenges you. It forces you to face your fears, and it asks you to be brave. But most importantly, it gives you the freedom to embrace a future that is all your own, and that is the kind of love that changes everything. So, as we wrap up this story, I want you to think about your own life. Are you living the story you were told to live? Are you following the path that others have set for you? Or are you listening to your heart, finding the courage to embrace the love that truly lights you up? It's never too late to make a change, to embrace the unknown, and to follow your heart, even if it leads you down a path less traveled. James and Antonio found each other when they allowed themselves to break free from the constraints of expectations. Their love wasn't neat, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that's what makes it worth celebrating. True love doesn't come with a set timeline or a perfect plan. It comes when we least expect it, when we're willing to step outside of our comfort zones and embrace something real. And when we do that, we open ourselves up to a life filled with deeper meaning, deeper connections, and deeper love. So to anyone out there questioning their own path, remember that true love doesn't come with boundaries. It doesn't come with rules or restrictions. It comes when we let go of what we think we should want and embrace what we truly desire. It's messy, it's complicated, but it's also the most beautiful thing we can ever experience. If you've learned something from James and Antonio's story, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you care about. Let them know that love, in all its forms, is worth fighting for. Because the most beautiful love stories are the ones that make us feel alive. They are the ones that challenge us to be brave enough to embrace the truth of who we are, and bold enough to choose a love that knows no boundaries. And if you feel inspired, hit that subscribe button and share this story. There's always someone out there who needs to hear it, someone who needs to be reminded that they deserve the kind of love that sets them free. Remember, true love isn't about following the rules. It's about following your heart, no matter where it leads you. Thank you for being part of this journey, and don't forget, your own love story is waiting to be written. Choose it with courage, choose it with authenticity, and choose it with love.